Well, before I actually got involved in the project, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I knew the movie well, the 1950s movie, but I knew nothing about the style of the novel or how long it was or anything. And we got a hold of it, and I read that, and I read the original script that was done for the Don Siegel movie, and then I began the adaptation with Phil Kaufman and I talking all the time. Well, I got involved when Bob Solo, the producer, approached me without even telling me that Phil Kaufman wanted to direct a remake of the movie. And I said, I'd love to do it. And then after my deal was made, he told me Phil was involved. And Phil and I knew each other. And we never worked together, but we were sort of in a small social circle in Los Angeles because he would go back and forth. So we discovered we were on it together. I'm sure he knew I was doing it before he said, yeah, I mean, it didn't matter who was doing it. Well, I think Phil and I worked really closely throughout the whole development process. We met constantly. I showed him pages along the way. And it was a really wonderful collaboration because we knew that it was going to start fairly soon. It was going to be a low budget, so we had to be in perfect sync so that he could, I wouldn't go off and write stuff that was beyond his reach to put on film. And because of the decision to move at the last minute from a small town to a big city, the script never stopped getting worked on. And so it required my moving to San Francisco and living in a hotel for the production. And Phil was very giving. He took me onto sets. We looked at, Pod Central. I saw all this stuff that he was finding along the way. We actually were in some of the location scouts for the small town version too. But that's a smart move for a director, I think. That's why I tried to keep Mac around for Buckaroo, because if you can get the writer's head into where you're going to shoot and then you suddenly need some material, it's not detached from the reality of production. So, I was able to be fairly close to it and give him what he needed.
I'm sorry. I can start the test right away.
Oh, it's okay, but Carter's doing it. And there's something wrong with the baked potato. Either the sour cream is phony or the chives or the butter.
I'm really sorry, Matthew. I got up on time. It was Jeffrey.
When the mad dentist get up to this time?
I don't know. He was just weird.
It's crazy. All dentists are crazy.
Well, I don't think we really spent a lot of time talking about it having a larger meaning other than preserving the individual spirit. It wasn't political. It wasn't anything that had to do with, communist conspiracies and things like that. It was just a kind of a vote for, don't become a conformist, don't march with the herd, find a way to, make your own path in life. And then it was going to also be a dark comedy. There were certain essential things that we both agreed would be fun to do. The biggest change was a decision to move it out of a small town environment into a city. And the first draft I did was small town. It really stayed very close to the original. But at some point, and it was on a specific afternoon in a story conference when Phil and I were sort of talking about things, that the idea came up that we'd made a huge miscalculation and that the center of energy and maybe threat to the individual was in an urban area in our era. And so we went down the hall and talked to Mike Medavoy and said, we were something like a month away from principal photography, but that we felt we'd made a huge mistake, and we explained why. And he said, if you guys think you can do it, stay on your schedule. And that's why I was in San Francisco for the whole shoot, changing the script from a little backwater town to a big metropolis. Well, I think the big reason to change it from a small town to a big city was, as I said, the idea that a big city was where you could lose your individuality. But it also, on a very practical level, was a more exciting thing to aim a camera at. I mean, it had more energy, it had more mystery, it had deeper, darker shadows and lights twinkling in the background. So it just made graphic sense as well as thematic sense. And we just went for it with reckless enthusiasm. I don't think that anything that was happening in the 70s politically affected what we were doing. I really, really remember it all being about loss of identity, loss of humanity, being sucked into large organizations, marching with the crowd, and that's applicable at almost any time if your philosophy is don't do that. So you could take that movie and set it in any time and make that statement. But it also kept it in the best sense a more general idea, because then it can presumably be looked at 10 or 15 years later, and you don't have to know the political climate of the moment that it was made to understand what's going on inside it. It's just about people.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Lock the door! Lock the door!
They're coming! They're coming! Help! Help! They're coming! They're coming! Listen to me! Listen! Help me! You're next, please! Please! You're next! We're in danger! Please, listen to me! Something terrible! Please! You're next! Here they are! They're already here! Come! You're next! They're coming! They're coming!
Must have done something.
Kevin McCarthy is in the film, I think, basically because he was willing to be in it somewhere, and Phil was trying to get that little string running back to the other movies. That's why Don Siegel's in the movie. Mm-hmm. And once Kevin said he'd do it, we then, sort of sat around and said, so now what? And of course, the big controversy about the ending of the original was that nobody paid attention to him, and we thought, well, let's really have nobody pay attention to him. Let's kill him. And get any sense of hope really dashed at that moment, because a guy who knew what was coming was silenced. In our version of the movie, Don Siegel is a cab driver, and taking Matthew and Elizabeth are basically stopped at a roadblock, and Don Siegel's the cab driver who almost feels like he's taken him to the roadblock. I mean, it's deliberately ambiguous about, is he part of it, or is he just an innocent cab driver who's being ensnared by the pods? I don't think that I met Don Siegel while we shot this movie, because although I was in San Francisco, there were days when I was just writing, holed up in a hotel, and that was a one-day shoot, probably even half of a one-day shoot, and so I only recall it from dailies. I mean, I certainly wish I'd been there, but can't have everything,
Both of them.
Well, the decision to make the destruction of the pods pretty brutal was something that Phil and I sort of mutually wanted to do, because we wanted it to be a very scary film. And if you smash one of these things, you're essentially smashing an embryo inside it. And I think it was just time to go for broke on these things, to really instill that paranoia, to say they're not just dusty vegetable husks, they're flesh and blood in a weird way, and you hit it with a shovel, it's gonna rupture. It's fun to do that if you're going to be honest with your theme and not say, oh, we have to be kind of careful, we don't want to offend. I actually was there for a lot of the night shooting, so I did get to see some of the special effects being shot, and the memorable one is the dog with the human face, because that was unsettling to see, just standing there knowing that his handler was 10, 15 feet away. But when they let him go and he ran right up to the camera with that face, I think everybody on the set that day backed up a bit, and it's very effective in the film. But that was the era when you had to do that stuff. You couldn't put it in later. You couldn't do CGI on it. So. Well, when you decide to do something like put a human face on a dog, I don't know. You kind of have to be there that night to know when Phil sees what it's really going to look like, whether he has second thoughts or whether he just says, go for it, because it's clearly not essential. You can dump it, but if you don't shoot it, you never have a shot at it. And if you never put it in the movie, you can't see how an audience is going to react. And it worked amazingly well when the first group of people saw it. It was chilling. And that's why those risks are worth taking, because you can't presume to know everything when you're shooting. There's no way.
Elizabeth.
Well, because I was in San Francisco for the whole shoot, to my recollection, my routine changed from week to week. If there was a heavy rewriting session coming up because we were coming upon a sequence that either the location had called for changes or something that had happened in the movie already suggested it, then I probably wasn't on the set much at all, because I was trying to write pages and show them to Phil at night. But then there would be those 2 or 3 day stretches when he was comfortable with what I'd done, or maybe he wanted changes literally the day he was shooting it. So I got to hang out on the set quite a bit and watch really talented people. I mean, I learned a lot watching that movie get made, watching the cinematography and the actors and Phil interacting with them all. It was a really wonderful experience. I had a prior history with Donald Sutherland because I rewrote a movie in Florida called Lady Ice that he was in, and it was sort of a reversion, a different kind of Thomas Crown affair, same writer. And so Donald and I hit it off fairly well then. So when Phil cast him in Body Snatchers, it was a pleasure because he was a friend of sorts, and I knew his acting technique, and I knew that he was going to bring a calming presence. That was a very pleasant memory, and I met Jeff Goldblum and bonded with him on that, and that's why he wound up in Buckaroo Banzai, because we have a history there. So I have good memories of making that movie. People were, for the most part, having a good time all across the board and moving quickly, and I think that's important. I think the energy can sometimes be apparent on the screen because you don't have time to play around. And so, good actors. Veronica Cartwright, extraordinary to watch her work. I mean, and the mud bath sequence, it's unforgettable, but just because it was eerie and because everybody was spot on. And so, pleasant. Not always pleasant making a movie. This one was. Brooke Adams I met on the movie, so I had no prior history at all and didn't have any expectations, and she was a delight. And she has that moment where she rotates her eyeballs. That's the kind of energy that she would be willing to bring to something, because she showed Phil one day that she could just do that. They were just talking, and of course, this is what I like about Phil. He said, well, we'll use it. How many people can do that? So it found its way into the movie, and that delighted me because I like it when you take chances, and that's one of them. Well, Leonard Nimoy is a hard person to get to know. I mean, there are actors that you just immediately have what you would call a kind of normal encounter with as a person. Jeff's that way, Donald's that way, Brooke was. But Leonard always had a sense of reserve, and he had a way of making himself seem perhaps more important than he was. And but the character, Kibner, was that kind of a guy too. So some actors want to, stay in that mode. I just never sensed that he got really loose anywhere in life. And that could be really, an inaccurate assessment of him. But that's what I felt like on the set was, you're not going to be Leonard Nimoy's best friend. Just, smile and say hello to him and talk to him casually and then move on.
You don't have to leave the city. Nothing changes. You can have the same life, the same clothes, the same car.
But what happens to us?
You'll be born again into an untroubled world, free of anxiety, fear,
Wait.
hate.
David, you're killing us.
That's not true. David's right. Your minds and memories will be totally absorbed. Everything remains intact.
You've never agreed with him in your life before. What are you talking about? What are you...
There's a real story about the way that closing shot was kept secret from everybody, because Phil and I decided at some point that was going to be the end of the movie, that Donald would get nailed. But we didn't want anybody anybody in production or in the cast to know it was heading down that dark road. So I had a bogus end on there. I mean, she didn't finger him. You had a sense that they locked eyes and that somehow there were only two of them left maybe in the world, but they were going to fight. And after everything was said and done, it was the last thing, I think it was the last thing Phil shot. We just produced the 2 or 3 pages that had the ending that everybody saw and went for it. And I don't think he shot the other ending. Because I think that's a smart move, because somebody's going to force you to use the easy way out. And that happened on the original Invasion when there was no hospital scene at the end, and nobody came running in and said, they're out on the highway, and everybody turns and believes Kevin McCarthy. Well, we didn't want Donald to, be able to overcome this. It's more frightening if you see the good people try but fail. It says it's up to you now.